What is the purpose for doing a documentary video for Iowa early history, Glaciers to Settlement? This synthesis provides an overview of early Iowa history and explains why Iowa's land is unique. Hopefully viewers will be encouraged to pursue all areas that spark an interest and to tie Iowa history into the broader tapestry of U.S. world history events. Extensive author's notes are provided to suggest areas of further research. Iowa's geology has played a major role in its history and settlement. After the Earth's landmass, known as Pangaea, broke into continents, there were 15 major tectonic plates that continually moved. The study of plate tectonics' current theories proposes that there was probably more than one huge landmass over the last billion years. Scientists believe there may be a cycling of huge landmass that breaks up into continents and moves back together and then breaks up again, riding on the Earth's mantle. From fossil and rock studies, we know that around 300 to 400 million years ago, Iowa land was part of the Appalachian landmass of the North American continent, one of the oldest in the world. For a period of time, Iowa was covered by a large inland sea that added a matrix of minerals for later Iowa soils. Starting over 300 million years ago, Iowa was covered with huge lush vegetation that created coal deposits. For millions of years, land masses continued to change. About 2.6 million years ago, a series of 4 glaciers started to cover large parts of Iowa during the Ice Age, the last glacier ending nearly 12,000 years ago. The melting glaciers, along with western winds, made a unique geological feature of yellow soil 200 miles in length, known as the Luss Hills, that are along Iowa's western border near the Missouri River. In north-central Iowa, glaciers carved out lakes with extreme depths down to 136 feet, known as East and West Okoboji and Spirit Lakes. On the eastern border, there were steep limestone cliffs left along parts of the Mississippi River. The moving glaciers helped create the Great American Plains and Prairie. This grassland area, like other grasslands around the world, such as steppes, pampas, veldts, and the savannas, were vital for agricultural food produced for humans. Today, the world's original grassland areas are estimated to provide approximately 70% of food produced for humans. There are about 200,000 plant species. Only a few hundred have been domesticated, and in recent centuries, just 5 grains have supplied more than half of the calories needed to sustain human life: wheat, corn, rice, barley, and sorghum. Iowa was the only state that was almost entirely covered by big bluestem grass, Andropogon gerardi, after glaciation. Surrounding states had small amounts of the tall grass prairie. The glacier's grinding movements over boulders created a variety of tills, soils without organic matter. Glaciers left rivers above and water aquifers below the surface. The massive amount of glacial till left behind formed the base for very fertile, deep soils that covered Iowa. Iowa's climate had good rainfall and abundant ground lightning storms. Lightning started the necessary annual grass fires to prevent tree growth and maintain a prairie biome. The big bluestem, estimated to be 80% of the prairie that covered Iowa's soils, was unique and played an important role in Iowa's history and in the world's history of food production. True prairie biomes are dominated by only one variety of tallgrass, with lesser amounts of broad-leafed blooming plants called forbs, along with insects and animals. For Iowa's prairie, big bluestem grass had a huge and deep root system down 7 feet or more that pushed the grass upward to 6 to 8 feet, or even taller. Except for rivers and a few lakes, Iowa's prairie had little surface water all year, but did have adequate rainfall of 30 to 40 inches per year required for its tallgrass prairie. Iowa's soil types allowed water to percolate through the soil where it became groundwater. Earlier Iowa settlements stayed near the rivers instead of being on the open rolling prairie. When farms were created on the prairie, farmers dug wells and built windmills to get the groundwater. The thick, coarse tallgrass was undesirable for large grazing herds and made it nearly impossible to break the sod using early eastern iron plows. The expansive American plains west of Iowa had different soil types that grew shorter grasses, making the plains more desirable for grazing large herds of bison, or buffalo, and later cattle. However, without adequate soil and rainfall, the plains could not sustain a tallgrass prairie biome like the one in Iowa. Before European settlement, when French explorer Louis Joliet's party first experienced eastern Iowa river valleys while descending the Mississippi River, they described them as rivers flowing from a westward country full of grasses, flowers, bison, deer, turkeys, and wild birds. Another description of eastern Iowa was given by an early 1800 settler and recorded in Henry Sabin's Iowa history text. In the spring, the grass was tender green and covered with flowers. The groves were rich in blossoming rosewood, dogwood, and crabapple, wild cherry, and wild plum. The wild rose, Iowa's state flower, was abundant. In the summer, the prairie was like a sea, the tall, coarse grass dried to a golden hue, waving in the wind. The early flowers were low like violet and strawberry, but as the year advanced, they became gaudy on long stems which bore them to a level with the thick grass. Iowa was beautiful in spring, but there was a contrast between the lush tree-lined river valleys and the isolated and treeless tallgrass prairies. An early description of surface water on the prairie was stated by Dr. David Owen in 1852. The majority of streams that constitute the western system of Iowa drainage either run along the whole or only a part of their course depending on the season, upon that peculiar deposit known as bluff deposit. Their banks are 5 to 10 feet in height, quite perpendicular, so that they make the streams almost everywhere unfordable and a great impediment to travel across the open country where there are no bridges. In 1853, Professor George Clinton Swallow described Iowa's soil. Wells dug in this soil require only to be walled to a point just above the water line. Yet compact as the soil is, it is very porous, so the water which falls on its surface does not remain, but percolates through it, leaving little surface water. Since the prairie was eradicated by farms, it is difficult for anyone today to imagine what the original tallgrass prairie, consisting of more than 80% thick big bluestem grass, was really like. Early explorers got lost in it on horseback. Later in the 1800s, to assist travel across Iowa land, over 10,000 miles of rails were built to entice settlers to come to Iowa. To allow movement of goods and supplies, Iowa built highways and over 100,000 miles of earth roads around nearly every section or square mile of farmland to ensure a reliable means of transporting people and products. Most of Iowa's prairie was far from flat, as its many terraced rolling hills of farmland today give visual testament. The amount of new tree growth today shows how Iowa would have been a woodland state had it not been for the annual huge prairie grass fires that kept its prairie treeless. Initially, Iowa's massive tallgrass prairie discouraged settlement except along its tree-lined rivers. Iowa is surrounded by large rivers, including the Missouri River flowing east across the state of Missouri to the Mississippi River south of Iowa's southern border, the Minnesota River flowing east across Minnesota across Iowa's northern border, the Mississippi River that makes the eastern border, and the Missouri and Big Sioux rivers that make the western border. High limestone cliffs along the Mississippi River and 200-foot-high loess hills along the Missouri River also served as barriers to reach the Iowa prairie. Important rivers of Iowa's early history are the Des Moines River, that ran northwest to southeast diagonally across Iowa, and the Turkey, Cedar, Iowa, and Nottoway rivers, along with the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. Rivers and portages were important to tribes to define their lands and to determine their movements. The treeless prairie, on hills with little surface water, had several smaller rivers and lots of creeks with steep banks, with or without water flowing, that were difficult to cross. Wagon trails to California and Oregon did not cross Iowa. It was easier to skirt Iowa and follow the Missouri River west. There were few permanent settlements of tribes that had been identified in Iowa by Europeans in the 1600s due to the nomadic plains tribes living on the Great American Plains and Prairie. North American protohistoric tribes, those in transition to the advent of literacy and writings by historians, can be placed in one of 9 linguistic root groups. Only 2 groups, the Plains and the Northeast Woodland, were directly involved in Iowa history. The most notable Plains tribes connected to Iowa history are the Sioux or Dakota Nation, Kansas, Omaha, Osage, Winnebago, Missouri, Oto, and Iowa, who spoke languages with the same linguistic root of Siouan. However, the Iowa and Oto evolved to a more agrarian culture because they lived on Iowa rivers with rich soil and rainfall, following the ways of their woodland neighbors. These tribes still made seasonal bison hunting trips to the west of Iowa, lived in bark lodges, and used bark canoes different from other plains tribes. The northeastern woodland tribes most directly involved with Iowa history are the Algonquin, Huron, Iroquois Nation, Shawnee, Illini Confederation of Illinois, Potawatomi, Fox or Meskwaki, and Sac or Sauk. They were originally from the Northeast, Canadian, Great Lakes areas and spoke languages with the linguistic root of Algonquin. The Plains tribes were located in Iowa when found by the French, who were exploring areas for fur trapping in the 1600s. The Sauk decimated the Illini in 1667 in western Illinois. Small groups of Sauk Fox, now called the Meskwaki, later moved to the west side of the Mississippi River, but their main camps were near where Rock Island, Illinois is today. After the Black Hawk War of 1832, all Sauk Fox were removed from Illinois to Iowa. Iowa was the land where these 2 groups, the Plains and the Northeast Woodland tribes, met. Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette's party traveled 8 days down the Mississippi River before finding human tracks on the Iowa side, made by the Illini, or Illinois, a Northeast Woodland tribe. This helped create a false impression of nearly vacant land to the west. The Northeast tribes, like the Iroquois, had been pushed south earlier by French fur traders. Old maps in the 1600s show the Iroquois Nation had relocated from Canada to south of the Great Lakes, New York area. The federal government continued the policy of supporting settlers expanding westward by pushing the Northeast Woodland tribes further and further west by engagement and treaties.